Hello and welcome everyone. My name's Stuart Cleland and welcome to the Boleskine Talks initial series of lectures. We are going to be bringing in a number of academics over the next few months to talk about aspects and topics that would be of interest to those who are interested in the history and the heritage of the Boleskine House and the Boleskine House Foundation. We're a registered charity in Scotland who look to restore the house and turn it into a community hub. And as part of that, we're looking to try and celebrate the history and the heritage surrounding this amazing building. We will be delivering quite a few different lectures over the next few months, some of which will be focused more on nature and well-being. This particular stream, the first one that we have tonight, is on esotericism, Scottish history, academic history, and we'll be inviting interested parties to come along and join with us as we discuss these topics. Tonight, we've got our guest speaker, Kirsty Pattison, who is from the University of Glasgow. She's coming along tonight to talk to us about Hermeticism in medieval Scotland. Thank you, Kirsty, for coming along. We really appreciate your time, and it looks like we've got a number of people here excited to hear what you are presenting on this evening. If we just get stuck in, if you could tell us a bit about yourself, Kirsty, how was it you got into this field of research, and what's your story leading up to your presentation?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Boleskine House Foundation for having me. It's a pleasure. It probably won't be a surprise to know that being a Scottish lass and growing up in with a love of heavy metal and all things esoteric, it has a special place in my heart, as it does with many of my friends. So it's a real honour and privilege to be able to be part of this lecture series. I, like most people in the 90s that are now in their early 40s or mid 40s, became interested in esoteric ideas or practices when the movie The Craft came out. I think that was a very life-changing film for many 13, 14-year-old young people then. And that sort of generated a lifetime of learning. In my early 30s, I decided enough was enough. I was sick of having a career in hospitality, which is a great job to have, not to sing any hospitality out there. I loved it, but I really decided that this was the time to actually maybe do something that I was really passionate about and that I'd always been studying along the way. So I decided to go back to university, joined the University of Glasgow, and from there completed a master's looking at, I kind of focused on Italian theurgy and mysticism, because I come from a theology and religious studies background, and that synthesis with the mystical experience. But my real passion bubbling away was kind of what's going on in Scotland. And the more I was learning about all these other different things that were going on in all these other countries, I was like, well, where's Scotland in this? So I decided to do my PhD, probably because I'm a bit of a, as you will see with some of the stuff I'm going to say today, and there's probably a bit of a masochistic streak there when we look at medieval Scottish history. The sources are limited, but it's been a real passion. So I'm going to present to you today a part of my PhD research, which I'm hopefully going to finish soon.
Thank you. I'm a trustee at Boleskine House, and part of my role is about the heritage and the educational outreach of the work of the foundation, and trying to help people understand Scotland's role in the history of Western esotericism is central to that. For some of the listeners here today that might not know the meaning of that word, could you give us like a brief definition of what esotericism is and what it means?
That's kind of, well, that's a very loaded question as well, you know, Stuart. I was away in Glenesk for 4 days last week actually discussing the very meaning of such a word. I suppose the best way to describe it is it's a great sort of, it's a term that's used that describes several practices that sometimes have maybe flown under the radar of traditional scholarship, so things like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, but it can also mean things that have been rejected. The Votahanograph sort of brings it into this rejected knowledge type things. So it's a lovely little catch-all term, I think, that explains practices that we know that people have deep spiritual and religious connections to, but that have just not necessarily been looked at by history or by scholarship as kind of mainstream practices. So we kind of lump things together lovingly under this term esotericism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of our aspirations at the foundation is turning it into a hub for the study of Western esotericism in Scotland. If somebody was interested in studying esotericism academically, what kind of advice would you give them?
That's a really good one as well. I mean, currently within the UK, obviously it depends where you can move to. Amsterdam obviously has the kind of the biggest hub at the moment. There is some great work going on in universities in the States. Pennsylvania Press particularly have great work there with Claire Fanger. UK-wise, though, if you're based in the UK, there's now a master's at Exeter University that people can do. My own path was that I, through doing my degree in theology and religious studies, I basically shoehorned magic into every single subject that I could possibly do. And I had really lovely, supportive faculty members that allowed me. So, you know, if I was doing, you know, the Bible, Book of Judges, I found magic in there and was able to write about it. So there are ways, you know, if you cut to get around it. And then once you're into that kind of master's situation, depending whether you do research or taught, there are far more options out there. But as an undergrad, you kind of, if you haven't done an undergrad first, you kind of have to wiggle your way to navigate through what you'd like to do.
Thank you. Well, we're really chuffed to have you here tonight, Kirsty. We really appreciate your time. So whenever you're ready, if you just want to get your PowerPoint loaded, if I can ask everybody to ensure that they're on mute, and Kirsty will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Right, can everybody see the power? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I would like to preface this talk by saying that what I'm about to present to you today is only one part of my PhD research, which undertakes to explore esoteric themes such as Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and Christian Kabbalah, and their introduction to Scotland prior to 1560, which is the year that marks the start of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland. As far as I'm aware, this is the first study of its kind, and what I'm going to present to you today will no doubt raise more questions than it answers. There is still much to be done in the field of Scottish esotericism, particularly in the late medieval and early modern period. But it is hoped that this research will go some way to ensuring and encouraging others that there is much more to discover and many avenues for future research that so far I've not been able to consult. Therefore, this paper represents tentative steps forward to understanding the role of Hermeticism in late medieval Scotland. So without further ado, I will begin. The Scots Macker, for those that don't speak Scots, that means poet. Robert Henryson is considered by some scholars to be a distinctive voice in the Northern Renaissance. Henryson's 633-line version of the Orpheus myth, written in Middle Scots, has divided scholarship, particularly in the field of Renaissance Scottish literature. John McQueen argues that Henryson's Orpheus represents Neoplatonism and Orphism in 15th century Scotland, highlighting that, quote, incorporated in the poem is ample evidence for a second level of allegory proper based on Neoplatonic doctrine, metaphor, and numerology, end quote. In contrast, Matthew P. McDermott counters that Neoplatonism is, quote, certainly not a philosophy that was likely to appeal to the experience, morals, and beliefs of the practical Scot, end quote. The debate surrounding the extent to which Orphism and Neoplatonism influenced Henryson's Orpheus exemplifies a much larger discussion regarding the place of esoteric ideas in medieval and early modern Scotland. There is a growing awareness in wider mainstream scholarship that subjects which are esoteric in nature played an important role in the intellectual history of the Renaissance period in the Latin Christian West. However, the influence of these streams of thought in Scotland remains an understudied area. Before we can explore Hermeticism and its roots in Scotland, it's important to acknowledge the problems faced by researchers exploring these ideas in medieval and early modern Scotland. The main issue is that of primary sources, particularly the loss of records, manuscripts, and books, and there are several factors at play here. Curator of Manuscripts at the National Library of Scotland, Ulrika Hogg, explains, quote, the survival rate of medieval Scottish manuscript volumes is generally low. For example, only 1% of religious manuscripts of the Roman Catholic use, many of which were systematically destroyed during and after the Scottish Reformation, are believed to still be in existence, end quote. These problems are further compounded by environmental factors such as the damp weather, which Scotland is very famous for, and poor storage facilities for manuscripts in the period. The destruction of libraries and records during the times of war, particularly with England and the Reformation, also impacted libraries. Incidents of looting, the integration of collections such as the Scottish Royal Library into institutions such as the British Museum and the British Library, saw the early librarians sell duplicate copies of works to raise money for the new institutions. This feeds directly into private collectors of books and manuscripts. In the case of works with esoteric interest, Daniel Bellingrad and Bernd Christian Otto have shown that private collectors and the black market trade contributes to the problem with tracing manuscripts and books on subjects such as alchemy, astrology, and what is often described as learned or intelligent magic. However, despite these problems, it is possible to begin a picture regarding manuscript and book culture in Scotland with the help of some of the surviving library lists, as well as an examination of the chronicles and literature produced in the late medieval period in Scotland. This paper will focus on teasing out the roots of Hermeticism in Scotland. Jan Asplund describes Hermeticism as, quote, one of the undercurrents of Western cultural memory, and although it has never been a main current, it has never been entirely marginal, nor entirely forgotten, end quote. There are several ways in which Hermetic ideas were preserved throughout history. We find discussions, both positive and negative, regarding Hermes Trismegistus in the Church Fathers. A Latin translation of the Asclepius was also known to the Church Fathers and Doctors of the Church. There are also a number of texts which belong to the pseudo-Aristotelian tradition. In the Latin West, many of these sources are preserved in the Alexander tradition, which places Hermes Trismegistus as a contemporary of Aristotle. There are also a number of important Arabic sources which make their way into the discourse of the Latin West through the 12th and 13th century translations. The rediscovery of the Corpus Hermetica and the subsequent translation from Greek into Latin by the Florentine scholar Marsilio Ficino was first completed in 1463 and is often held to have reignited an interest in the legendary figure. Ficino's development of a Prisca Theologa, or a true ancient theology, sees Hermes placed much earlier in history, often viewed as a contemporary of Moses, depending on who you read and in what tradition. As we will see in this paper, our understanding regarding the time in which Hermes is purported to have lived will be helpful for identifying the possible Hermetic source materials Scots were engaging with. There's one piece of scholarship that must be addressed when exploring the development of Hermeticism in Scotland. In Restoring the Temple of Vision, Schuchard argues that Hermetic and Kabbalistic traditions that are preserved in later 18th and 19th century Ecossaic Masonic records and works are linked to Scotland's founding myth, which relates the story of the Egyptian Gaithias and his marriage to the Greek Scotia. Forced to leave their homeland, Gaithias and Scotia flee to Spain and send their son Hyber to explore the north in the hope of finding a new homeland. Hyber settles in Ireland, now Hibernia. It is from here that the Scots send settlers to the new land, which they name Scotland. Schuchard notes that while in Egypt, Gaethius was a contemporary of Moses, and it is due to this Egyptian Mosaic Spanish myth, quote, the role of Jewish and Arabic learning in the development of Scottish national consciousness becomes comprehensible, end quote. For Schuchard, these connections date back to the 11th century in Scotland, and it is this contention that has helped to shape the way in which I approached my own research. If Scots were particularly aware of Ficino's Prisca Theologa, the suggestion that a universal ancient wisdom had its foundation in ancient Egypt and Greece would have been an attractive proposal for Scottish intellectuals in the late medieval and early modern periods. However, evidence that Scots were drawing these connections as far back as the 11th century has thus far been elusive. One of the main aspects of my research has been to attempt to trace works important to the development of Hermeticism in Scotland. So far, I have yet to find any records of Clement of Alexandria Stromata or Lactantius's Divine Institute, which have provenance prior to the mid-16th century. These are the texts that are actually positive with regards to Hermes. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that these works were never available in Scotland, but we must be cautious in our approach in light of the surviving evidence discovered so far. We do know that the pseudo-Augustinian work entitled Against Five Heresies contains extensive translations of Asclepius and is recorded in the 13th century Registrum Angli library records at both the monasteries in Holyrood in Edinburgh and St Andrews. However, quite interestingly, Augustine's City of God is not mentioned in any of the 5 Registrum Angli lists, and it's only first recorded in Scotland in Aberdeen Cathedral in a list of 1436. So far, I've only been able to find one surviving copy of the Corpus Hermetica with provenance to 16th century Scotland. The Hermetica is part of a compendium of works transcribed and commented on by the French humanist doctor and writer Symphorien Champier, published in Lyon in 1507. On inspection of the edition, there is no marginalia or markings in the Hermetica section of the book to suggest how the text was being used by its owner, the Canon Alexander Galloway, the rector of Kinkell. I will return to this edition of the Hermetica shortly when I explore the Scottish Chronicles for further evidence of Hermetic ideas and to challenge Schuchard's hypothesis. There are 2 entries of note in surviving library lists that deserve attention, although they fall outside the framework of my current research. Ficino's Hermetica is recorded in the library of Mary Queen of Scots. If the edition suggested by John Higgett in the Scottish Library is the 1554 bilingual edition, then analysis of other surviving examples of this edition show that it does not contain Ficino's original preface, which includes details of his Prisca Theologa. The whereabouts of Mary's edition is currently not known and therefore unable to be consulted in more detail. Mary's library list also includes 4 works of Plato, including the Symposium and the Timaeus. This raises interesting questions, such as, does Mary's library present an example of an aristocratic Scottish Catholic library? Or were her interests in Platonism and Hermeticism a result of her time in France? For now, this is purely a matter of speculation. However, interest in Ficino is found in another Catholic library in the late 16th century. Ficino's work, entitled On the Christian Religion, also contains details of his Prisca Theologa and a discussion around Hermes Trismegistus. It's recorded as belonging to the Bishop of Dunblane, William Chisholm II, who died in 1593. This edition was published in Paris in 1559, and although John Durkin and Anthony Ross were able to consult and photograph the title page of the book for their 1961 edition entitled Early Scottish Libraries, my attempts to trace this edition to examine the work for marginalia has been unsuccessful and is so far ongoing. While these 2 early modern examples do not help us understand the reception of Hermeticism in the late medieval period in Scotland, they do raise interesting questions for the reception of Hermes. Could the lack of surviving source materials be due to the impact of the Reformation? Was Hermeticism seen as something distinctly Catholic for the reformers? These are all questions I hope one day to be able to answer. With the lack of surviving manuscripts and books, it's worthwhile asking the question, then, how would Scots have become aware of these esoteric trends that were developing on the continent? There are several ways in which Scots could have engaged with these esoteric ideas, including Hermeticism. In 1192, Scotland becomes a special daughter of the papacy in the absence of their own archbishop. This meant that the Scottish clergy were required to travel to the Curia to make supplications, receive their benefices, and deal with ecclesiastical matters that could not be attended at home. As well as having to attend the Curia for Scottish ecclesiastical matters, the clergy were also required to attend church councils to deal with wider ecclesiastical issues that faced the Latin Christian Church. These events meant Scots were often making recourse to the continent and in contact with their representatives who resided at the Curia. Travel to the continent is an important aspect for this reason, and there are a number of important developments in the history of magic and the development of esoteric ideas that occur at the Curia during the 14th and 15th centuries. The councils of Basel and Florence are recognized by scholars as important events for the development of diabolical magic, in the case of Basel, and the spread of esoteric ideas, such as the Chaldean oracles being falsely attributed to Zoroaster by the Greek visitor Platon to the Council of Florence, and the beginning of the so-called Plato-Aristotle controversy, which continued at the Curia into the 1460s. Both the councils of Basel and Florence were attended by large delegates of Scottish churchmen. I think it works out, we can trace at least 50 delegates, different delegates at each council, so 100 people from Scotland were there during those times at some point or another. So this gives ample opportunity for these ideas to come back to Scotland, and not just to one area, but to reach all over Scotland. Another important reason that Scots travel abroad was for education. Prior to the establishment of St Andrews around 1413, all Scots had to be educated abroad. By the end of the 15th century, Scotland would have 3 universities, St Andrews, Glasgow and Aberdeen, but many continued to travel abroad for higher degrees. The wars in England, with England, meant that the study in Oxford or Cambridge in the 14th century in particular was sporadic, and many Scots opted to study in France, especially at Paris, Orleans and Avignon. Paris and Orleans are of particular interest when looking at the history of magic, given the theological faculty at Paris was instrumental in condemnations against developing magical practices. In Orleans is often cited as a university in which necromancy was practiced. We also know that some Scots did study in Italian universities, but the surviving records make it hard to estimate exactly where they were studying and how many Scots made it to Italy during this time. What I hope to show by this quick overview is that there was plenty of opportunities for Scots to engage with the developing ideas on the continent and bring them home. It may also be possible to chart the impact of these ideas on Scotland by looking at our chronicles. And I suggest one of the strongest examples of this can be found in Walter Bower's Scotichronicon, written between 1440 and 1447, which directly corresponds with the Scottish churchmen's attendance at the councils of Basel and Florence. The earliest surviving Scottish Chronicle of Scotland by a single author is the Chronicle of the Scottish People, written by John Fordun, written between 1360 and 1384. It's a Latin work and comprises of 5 books, and it details the foundation of Scotland until the end of the reign of King David I in 1153. Fordun's work forms much of the basis for the future chroniclers of Scotland, and particularly Walter Bower, an abbot of the Augustinian order based on Inchcolm Abbey in the Firth of Forth, which is an island just off of Edinburgh. Bower expands greatly on Fordun's work, and the Scotichronicon actually is composed of 16 books in total. Furthermore, he added passages that reflect Bower's understanding of the esoteric ideas that we can see on the continent. Bower gives a warning about Zoroaster and his venture of magic. Plato and the Platonic thinkers, such as the Church Father Origen and Pseudo-Dionysius, are written about in a positive light. There is an inclusion of a passage which discusses the microcosm and the macrocosm, which is drawn from the Alexander tradition. We also start to see the inclusion of passages which mention pacts with the devil, as well as the deeds of magicians, witches, and necromancers, all of which are new and all of which reflect discussions that are on the continent. However, one of the figures missing is Hermes. The Scotichronicon was written prior to Ficino's translation, but we do not see Hermes being mentioned as a contemporary of Aristotle, nor is he included in the extended discourse or discussions around Aristotle and Alexander the Great, although we can see that Bauer is engaging with Alexander literature sources. We know that Bauer was an Augustinian monk, and he cites Augustine's City of God regularly throughout the Chronicle, so therefore he must have heard of Hermes. So this raises the question, was there a specific reason as to why Bauer does not at all recognize Hermes throughout the work? Is it due to his Augustinian background? As I mentioned earlier, the only surviving copy of the Hermetica is linked to Aberdeen. Galloway had connections to the newly founded University at Aberdeen and to the first principal, Hector Boyce. Boyce composed his own chronicle, or History of Scotland, in 1527. If Boyce had been aware of Ficino's Prisca Theologa and Hermes' connection to Moses, then one would expect to find such details in the extension of Scotland's foundation myth that we find in the preliminaria of his history. We know that Boyce was at least aware of Ficino, as he is the owner of Ficino's medical astrological work, De Triplici Vita, which we find extensive notes made in Boyce's hand in the marginalia of the text. This is also the earliest surviving example of Ficino's work in Scotland, with Boyce's edition being produced in 1497. However, Boyce also makes no reference to Hermes Trismegistus in his recounting of the Scotland foundation myth. This raises questions regarding to what extent Ficino's Prisca Theologa and the Corpus Hermetica were known in late medieval and early modern Scotland. So far, all the evidence I have found points to a much later date. There is one chronicle that is helpful for our discussion of the pseudo-Aristotelian connection to Hermes Trismegistus in Scotland. Adam Abel was a friar of Jedburgh Abbey who composed a chronicle entitled The Rot or Wheel of Time. The work is a vernacular translation into Scots of his original chronicle, believed to have been composed in Latin around 1533, although the Latin edition no longer exists. The vernacular version is dated to 1537 and survives in one manuscript edition currently held at the National Library of Scotland. The chronicle has received very little scholarly attention in comparison to the rest of Scotland's 16th century histories. We don't know much about Adam Abel, and much of what we do know comes from within the chronicle himself. He tells us that he was born in Preston Pans, known at the time as Salt Preston, and that he joined the Augustinian Canons Regular in Chaffray Abbey in 1495. It is unclear whether Abel attended university. Stephanie Marlowe Thorson's excellent research was unable to find any record of Abel attending St Andrews or Glasgow, nor was she able to find any record that he studied at Paris, Louvain, or Cologne, the continental universities most commonly attended by Scots at this time. At some point, Abel transfers to the Franciscans in Jedburgh, and it was during this time in Jedburgh that he composes his chronicle. Though he relied on Boyce for his history in Scotland, Thorson notes that, quote, as a historian, he does not much resemble Boyce, end quote. This is because Abel situates the Chronicle of Scotland in the wider context of the world, much more like Bauer, which allows us to see influence from the continent more clearly. Abel's Chronicle is the first work I have found so far that mentions Hermes Trismegistus by name in a Scottish source. The entry is very short, with Abel listing Hermes as a contemporary of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. That Abel places Hermes Trismegistus as a contemporary of Aristotle and Alexander shows that Abel knew not about the work of Ficino, but actually knows about him through the Alexander literature. Liana Saif explains that, quote, The Pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica are a group of surviving texts in Arabic that claim to record conversations between Aristotle and Alexander the Great. The content of these conversations include Aristotle giving instruction to Alexander about the cosmos, the coming to be of everything in it, and astral magic. More precisely, talismanry, rituals for attracting spiritual and planetary forces of the cosmos, the creation of amulets, and extensive astrological rules, end quote. It is this literature that Hermes Trismegistus is named as the teacher of Aristotle. So this entry shows that Abel was at least familiar with or had some form of access to this popular literature that was available in the medieval period. I've been unable to identify the Alexander literature that Abel might have been looking at. There's one hint found in the book list left to the University of Glasgow by Bishop John Lang, who died in 1483. The library list is dated to 1475 and includes the entry Epistola Aristotelis ad Alexandrium. However, without the surviving source, it's difficult to discern the contents of the manuscript. It's also unclear whether Abel travelled to complete his chronicle. The most popular pseudo-Aristotelian work throughout the Middle Ages was the Secretum Secretorum, or Secret of Secrets. It was through the Secretum Secretorum that Aristotle's image as, quote, a mage with consummate knowledge of occult properties, astral influences, and talisman construction was solidified, end quote. There are no records of this work in any of the extant Scottish library lists, nor the surviving works traced by Durkin and Ross. The only direct reference to it in Scotland is found in the last will and testament of Thomas Basenden, a printer who died in 1577. This records 3 items of the Secret of Secrets, evidence that the work was being published and available in Scotland towards the end of the 16th century. However, there was one corpus of medieval Scottish vernacular literature that was quite exciting and does give us a little bit more of an indication that Hermetic influences had made their way to Scotland. Sir Gilbert of Hay, who flourished between the 1450s and 1460s, translated several works of the Alexander tradition into Scots sometime in the middle of the 15th century. The Book of Alexander the Conqueror, which for ease I will now refer to as the BKA, provides some interesting material for our understanding of Hermetic ideas in the medieval contexts. The scribal epilogue of the BKA tells us that the work was translated at the insistence of Lord Erskine by Sir Gilbert de Hay. It is generally held that Hay's patron was Thomas Erskine, second Lord Erskine, who died in 1494, who during this period was embroiled in a dispute over the lands of the Earl of Mar, which had been seized by the crown. The epilogue also tells us that, quote, this noble book in parts of falsis mentit, end quote, by another scribe, who undertook the work between the months of May and August in 1499. It is difficult to know to what extent Hay's original translation has been amended by the second anonymous scribe. The poem contains over 19,000 lines and incorporates a diverse range of sources across the Alexander corpus, including the Secret of Secrets. Indeed, although the BKA draws on a wide range of sources, Anna Coughley argues that due to the amount of original material incorporated, it is more constructive to consider it as a standalone text rather than attempting to read it as a translation. Furthermore, Coughley finds that the multiple and many layered explorations of the genre at work in the BKA complicate any attempt to categorize the text, and that it should be rather viewed as a prime example of the richness and complexity of Scottish storytelling in the mid-15th century. I suggest that part of that storytelling is distinctly Hermetic in nature. The work survives in 2 manuscripts, and both are later than the original. The original dating of the work is presumed, as I said, to the 1430s. However, analysis of the handwriting of the surviving copies suggests manuscript A was copied in the 1530s, with manuscript B having a later 16th century dating. Both surviving copies of the work are missing the beginning section of the poem. Both manuscripts A and B contain several blank pages at the start, which suggests the copyists were hoping to complete the work once the original pages has been found. The missing section raises some interesting questions. The opening section sets out the divine provenance for the birth of Alexander. John Cartwright suggests that the Historia de Prelis is the most likely source for Hay, but cautions that Hay's version of this portion would have been only intermittently close to the original in either the details of the narrative itself or the interpretation. I've added the opening section of the Historia to the slide. Though Nyctantibus is his father, Alexander is conceived through trickery as Nyctantibus goes to Olympus, the wife of King Philip of Macedonia, in disguise. Thus, Philip is believed to be the rightful father at the start of the poem. How he interprets this passage is now lost to us, which is really frustrating, as this section would have most likely given us an indication of how he interprets the esoteric themes mentioned within the Scottish contexts. I'd also like to note here as well that the BK does not mention Hermes Trismegistus by name, although the themes within the poem that can be described hermetic in nature. Though the beginning of the poem is missing, it is most likely that at least the original composer of the poem was aware of the connection between the arts being taught by the Egyptian Nyctantibus and their hermetic connections and Scotland's national history. Furthermore, in the first part of the poem, it can be argued that Alexander himself is the perfect example of spiritual alchemy, a tradition we often link with Hermeticism. The traditional understanding of the alchemical process is viewed as the search for a stone or an elixir which could transmute metals into gold and grant perfect health. However, Claudia Wren observes that there was another tradition within the practice of alchemy that saw the practitioner consider its materials and apparatus as elements in a spiritual metaphor that brought around an inner transformation. Moreover, alchemical texts cannot be taken at face value. Owen Bentinck suggests that there was always something hidden to be gleaned by the attentive reader, and that the idea that alchemical secrets were potentially hidden just beyond the surface of things was a key component of alchemical hermeneutics. Therefore, to understand the BKA, it must be read through a hermetic lens. It is the BKA. In the BKA, Alexander represents the embodiment of the spiritual alchemical transformation. He's taught in astronomy, in art, magic, and necromancy by his birth father, Nyctantibus. Under the tutelage of Aristotle, Alexander, into moral virtue he him found it, and into wisdom he him ground it. Aristotle is the figure who teaches Alexander that there was but ein God innerly, and represents the transition of Alexander transforming from his demonic birthright into a godly king. We also know that Alexander was conceived through the deceit of magic, and he had no legal right to inherit his adopted father's kingdom. Nyctantibus had transformed into the figure of a golden dragon, which we hear about in the poem, to carry out his deceit, a symbol which is also significant to alchemy. It's through the guidance of Aristotle, Alexander transcends the corruption of his birthright and recognizes the power in the one true God. In the latter section of the poem entitled Of Regiment of Princes, the knowledge that is imparted to Alexander is given in more detail. The section discusses the roles of the planets and the elements, speaks of the invigation of spirits, and labours the importance of the recognition of the great God with all which world governs. Knowledge of these operations is deemed important, but recognising their place under God is what makes Alexander a truly wise ruler. The poem therefore does not discourage the use of these practices, but makes it clear that God is the highest power of all. Though the work does form part of the Mirror of Princes tradition, as suggested by Sally Mapstone, the hermetic themes within the poem should not be overlooked. Indeed, given that the reader is meant to work at the text to understand the deeper meanings hidden inside, the hermetic influence is hard to ignore. The argument for the presence of hermetic themes and the likelihood that they would be in some way recognised by the reader is supported by the volume of hermetic literature that we see across the rest of the Latin West and its incorporation into the Alexander tradition. Furthermore, there is a familial collection to the famed Scottish alchemist Sir George Erskine of Invercargill, who lived from around 1570 to 1646. His collection of alchemical texts were presented in 1707 to the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh by his grandson, the first Earl of Cromarty. This is a line of inquiry I'm very much looking forward to exploring as I continue to try and understand Scotland's connection to the esoteric. But unfortunately, because of the dating of it, it was outside of the remit of my current work for my PhD. The evidence presented in today's short discussion on Hermeticism in late medieval Scotland certainly raises more questions than it answers. The questions raised by the short discussion on the BKA highlight not only the complexity of the poem, but also show that further study could unlock more of the work's hidden meanings. When taken alongside the evidence of Abel's Wheel of Time, there appears to be a Scottish tradition of pseudo-Aristotelian Hermeticism present in late medieval Scotland, possibly as early as the 1450s, but certainly by the early 16th century. However, there are questions as to how widespread these ideas were, given our two key sources only survive in 3 manuscripts. Furthermore, our knowledge of the reception of the Corpus Hermetica and Hermes' place in the Prisca Theologia is so far greatly lacking in the Scottish context. However, there is much more excavation of the surviving sources still to be carried out, including the archives of the Scots colleges that were established on the continent after the Reformation, where some of the books were taken to try and protect them when the iconoclasts were burning libraries. But there's also the Schottenkirchen Monastery in Regenburg. There's private libraries and estate libraries that may also yield some interesting discoveries. So far, I've been unable to support Schuchart's hypothesis, especially with regards to early Hermetic connection in Scotland. None of the 16th century chronicles or histories of Scotland mention Hermes in connection with Gaethius and Moses, which one would expect to see, even if just being mentioned in passing, as evidenced by the inclusion of Zoroaster and his connections to magic in the chronicles written post-Council of Florence. As the evidence currently stands, these connections to Scotland's national myth are of a much later dating. So thank you for taking the time to attend this talk. The journey into understanding Scotland's relationship with esoteric practices, such as Hermeticism in late medieval and early modern period, is just beginning. And although I, myself, am severely biased, I think it's a very exciting field to be exploring and working in. I admit every day I discover more pieces of the puzzle and identify new avenues for exploration. And I hope you've enjoyed taking these tentative steps with me to uncovering some of Scotland's magical past. Thank you very much.